you want to go where doors are likely to open and lead to other doors. And if you don't do that, then I think you're making a big mistake.
I was trying to think about when I saw you last.
We saw each other at some bar in New York.
I remember that.
Post-pandemic, I think, or
No,
maybe
it was
pre-pandemic.
way pre.
Yeah.
No, and then, but the time I met you was at Nick Denton's house.
Yeah.
That was a weird meeting.
I
That
mean,
almost doesn't feel real in retrospect.
anything involving Nick is always a little bit weird. He's chill. He's mellowed out a lot, man.
He has?
Yeah, he's got like a husband now and like 2 kids. Just smokes a lot of weed, basically, and yeah.
But yeah, that was like, he basically called, that was a very disparate group of people.
Yeah.
Right after the election, of just people talking, sort of processing their weird trauma / surprise at what happened. I don't know what the purpose of it was exactly.
I think he saw himself as like an old tastemaker, like you have the salon of people, of intellectuals, and he kind of, when he was in his kind of post-Gawker mellowing phase, right?
Yeah.
He wanted to, like, he's a very intellectual guy, right? Like, he reads a lot of news, but like he was trying to cultivate something that was not exactly working. But
that was one of the weirdest nights of my life, because I went from that thing to have dinner with Peter Thiel.
oh yeah, that's really funny.
That's what I opened Conspiracy with. But like, it was just the contrast of basically, because it was also at Peter's house. Because I guess that's the thing that happens when you become really rich and successful, is you never go anywhere. Everyone has to come to your house.
Yeah.
And yeah, so it was like the thing at Nick's house and then the thing at Peter's house. These 2 people that had just spent the last 10 years trying to destroy each other.
That's cool. Yeah.
And they kind of embody the village and the river in a way. Like,
for sure.
Nick's, I guess,
Although
maybe
Nick is
halfway between.
Did you read the Ben Smith book?
No.
It's
The
pretty
media
good.
book?
Like just as a, there's a lot about Nick and Jonah Peretti. Just as a media entrepreneur / savant, you probably get some use out of it, I think. But
you kind of, that is interesting, right? Because are you technically sort of the village because you're in media? But what if you're a media entrepreneur and then you're taking a certain amount of risk, and there's a difference there, I guess.
sure. I mean, there's 2. I mean, one is that like before I got into the media, I played poker for a living and stuff like that, right? But yeah, if you have a more entrepreneurial bent and kind of, I think it's a big advantage. I think like on Substack, you find ways to like, it's not game the system, but it's just like, you have some understanding of what the value of your time is and what tends to move the numbers and what doesn't, right?
Yeah, you're not insulated from the economics of what you do, by definition, you are as an employee.
Yeah, no, it's just so different, right? It's like, okay, I go and play. We can talk about this on the show if you want, by the way.
No, this is what we're doing. Yeah,
okay.
This is the show.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Shit. Oh, you're one of those types.
Sure.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I've the misdirection. Yeah. But yeah, for years I was employed by one of the world's largest media companies, the Walt Disney Company, which had no incentive-based compensation like whatsoever.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, if I go and play in a poker tournament, which is something that I love to do, then it's kind of free, right? It's like basically you're kind of burning time on the clock now, right?
Yeah.
And like this year I was at the World Series of Poker, and like we had launched a newsletter, and there's all this news, right? It's like, Trump just got convicted of all these felonies, right? And I'm playing in a $1,000 buy-in tournament, and I'm like, if I write a post right now, the expected value of that is like a lot greater than $1,000, right?
Yeah.
So should I just punt the tournament? And probably you should, although you also get in a situation where like I think people need constraints, and like when you have a thing where you can kind of like publish a post and make, I'm not going to say how much, but like there's certain topics where like, and you can't like drive yourself crazy, and what are you like really maximizing for, I guess, but it's very different.
Well, especially I would say for people who are trying to think about how the sausage is made journalistically, if you're a journalist and there's always been somewhat of a ceiling on what you can make, and journalists are like upper middle class if you are successful at it. And then suddenly the economics of being your own media company where you are selling directly to consumers, suddenly it's like lots of money. It potentially could be lots of money. And that can be a very wicked set of incentives operating on someone who what they write or think has never been influenced by like how much it will or won't make them. And that's where obviously audience capture and stuff like that comes in.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of short run and long run, right? I mean, like, 2 days ago, I wrote a post that was very critical of Joe Biden, right?
Yeah.
And even though, there's no news value exactly. I mean, I think there's historical value in putting his stubbornness about dropping out in perspective, right? But like, that's just, you know, a post that like, it got lots of page views. It did not convert very well to subscribers, relatively speaking. And it probably, I've got like a lot of Kamala friendly audience because she's been rising in the forecast.
Sure.
But like in the long run, like people are paying me in many cases for my, you know, uncorrelated takes and for my independent takes, and like you're going to get what you're going to get, and I think that's really important. Or if you you know, and because the trick is like I don't like politics, right? I like elections. I think election forecasting are an interesting problem, and that like it's a little gamified, and that part's fascinating. But I don't care about like the State of the Union address. I have, as a citizen, policy preferences. I have an economics degree, but like I'm not concerned about like congressional procedure, for example, or things like that, or obscure special elections that don't have any national implication. So yeah, I'm just not gonna write about it, right? I mean, you know, and then you also get this thing where if you have like a newsletter, you either kind of just you're the brand, or it's like a brand like in the Substack ecosystem, like the Free Press or something, right? Where now all of a sudden it's like 35 people, and is there any in between there that kind of works? I mean, you can hire people to help you, but like you're your own brand, right, Ryan? And like, and you can do some degree of expansion, but if you stray too far, then it undermines the quality a little bit, I think. And because you're a kind of man of contradictions in some ways, and I am too, right? You know,
what are my contradictions?
So I don't know that much about all the Stoicism stuff. I was trying to bone up on it, but then I had all this political news, so I didn't really get to, because on the one hand, there's a Stoic side, but you're also a terrific like entrepreneur, right? Like that's a little, I mean, maybe on some deeper vector, it all makes sense, right? But on the surface, a little bit of tension, I suppose, right?
I guess. I mean, that's the same as the sort of journalistic tension where it's like, I care about truth and information and reporting, but if it's not actionable to someone, no one would pay for it. So I think there's always that tension. I think it's interesting too, because sometimes I get that about the entrepreneurial side. And then I go like, but what about the bargains, to speak of the village, which you talk a lot about in the book? Like, I'm not charging undergraduates $40,000 a year. You know what I mean? Is that somehow more ethical or less? That creates its own set of incentives, which arguably, first off, moral implications and then incentives. And I'm not sure they're any better, but sometimes we're just used to those incentives, so they kind of operate in the background. And then when something new comes up, then we're like questioning all parts of it. Even though it might actually be pure and get a better outcome. Yeah,
look, I think in the long run, it converges more than in the short run sometimes. It maybe doesn't converge perfectly. You know, in my career, I've always done stuff that I loved and that I worked really hard at and I thought added value and was differentiated. And, you know, you're getting something you can't get anywhere else. And like, there's no tricks involved. But at the same time, if like, you know, post A is going to make me, you know, 2x post B and I'm otherwise indifferent or mostly indifferent. Or if I'm on a flight from Seattle to Austin, I can be like, I could go and like relax and have a beer and listen to your podcast and things like that. Or I could like write an important post on Kamala Harris and her convention speech. Then, you know, that affects the incentives quite a bit.
But can you turn that off? So like when you think like I'm writing this or that, are you thinking like this is its expected return or this is the expected value? Because obviously that's partly how your mind works. I feel like I've had to work pretty hard at not thinking about that at all. Like, so I don't check stats on most things. I don't look at the replies of I want to have an audience rather than an audience have me.
Yeah, I think I'm in a phase where the newsletter is still relatively new. I mean, the paid product's been up for less than a year. So I think it's still pretty informative to have a sense for what works better and what doesn't, but it's often hard to predict. Like I did a post a month ago that was just 7 quick thoughts about the Kamala Harris / Trump polling, right? And it was like, I don't think it's quite dashed off. I'll explain in a minute, right? But it took 45 minutes to actually write. I write very fast, and like that got some like insane number of signups. I don't know quite why. Maybe the timing of it just hit right. And sometimes these more informal headlines convey more honesty and like authenticity. But the other thing is like I'm always processing stuff in the background. If you're a writer, then if you go, I did a speaking gig in San Francisco, right? And sometimes on these book tours, they don't really bother to like feed you very well, right? So I went out and got like some late night tacos and had a beer, right? And I'm like, but I'm thinking about like articles for the next 5 days and like processing stuff. So you're not like really off the clock with of creative content, I don't think. And so you're trying to like, I call it like nose to tail blogging, where like if you've put X amount of effort into thinking about something, even if it's something that's not necessarily in your venue, you're thinking about like, why is a certain sport popular in a certain part of the country, and you get really into this problem and things like that. And then like, I think you should kind of use those and not let effort that you've made go to waste,
or metrics decide that it's not worth doing.
Right. Yeah. And also, but there's also things like, I think I try to avoid having throwaway posts in an email newsletter.
Because people will stop opening?
We have 60% open rate still, which is kind of insane. No, because like you're pushing into someone else's space.
Sure.
And I don't want to have an email that like, if there's 3 things, it's like, here's a link to a cool interview I did with Ryan, right? And here's a book tour event coming up, and here's a little gimmick or something, right? Or a cool book I read.
You have to respect the access that you have.
Yeah, because it's very different than pure web publishing. We're kind of a hybrid. Like basically half our traffic is from the web, and some people use like a traditional website. But I want to respect the email list.
Yeah, I think about that. Although when I was thinking, when you talk about decoupling in the book, and one of the things one version of sort of accidental decoupling for me is like you do it long enough, the thing you think is going to do amazing does terrible.
Yeah.
And then the thing that you don't think is going to do well does amazing. And you you kind of learn to decouple like sometimes your own intuition from what you do or don't do, or you learn maybe just to actually trust the intuition and ignore the data, because more often than not, you're right. So it's like sort of, as you said, short-term versus long-term sort of evaluations of things.
The thing that really took the product off was actually not politics stuff, but the NCAA basketball model. And like it was a Sunday.
Yeah.
I didn't have too busy a day, but I'm like, I bet if I spent all day on this, I could get like the NCAA basketball model revived. But is it worth it? It'd be really nice to have kind of a mental day off. I just did finish the book, right? And then you do it. And then like, by the time I'm going down my driveway, you're like adding like dozens of, it's just kind of crazy. And I had no idea that there was that much demand for it until you do it and you experiment.
Well, I thought the Peter Thiel stuff was fascinating in the book. And I think you asked me for his email. Is that
you did?
how
wasn't sure if it was, and that was actually like a door opening interview for me, right?
Okay.
In the original proposal for the book, there was a lot more about Wall Street. I'm based in New York, and I thought like, a hedge fund or something is like a more direct analogy as you're like moving out of like poker and sports betting and things like that. But the VCs were interested in talking to me, and they're interesting people, right?
Yes.
They're more, multifaceted than the hedge fund guys. The hedge fund guys are like, I have hedge fund friends, right? But they're a little bit more, I don't know, somewhere on the spectrum sometimes. And also they're guarded because they understand that like there are a finite number of like $20 bills lying on the street and they don't want someone else to pick them up. Whereas VCs kind of want some degree of contagion for their ideas.
Yeah, the Wall Street guys seem to be like, this is how to make the numbers go up, or like it's a math-oriented thing. Where with the VC ones that I've met, it's a philosophical approach to it as much as it's a data-driven financial.
Yeah, I don't think they are particularly materialistic exactly.
Yeah.
You go to, rich people's homes in Silicon Valley, and they're kind of low key and understated.
Yeah.
It's not Hollywood. It's not a penthouse apartment in Central Park, New York, or something like that.
Yeah.
Ironically, I think they're kind of irrational on some level, right? If you have basically reached a point where you have infinite money and you keep competing, you're doing it for the love of the game is a maybe more charitable way to put it, or because something in your DNA or your upbringing causes you just have this intrinsic property to like always battle, always battle, always battle.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what it's like. Peter's thing. I watched this interview with Seinfeld once, and he was saying that like a comedian is like a woodchuck. Like you don't know why they chuck wood, they just do it.
Yeah.
And it's like you just have this thing that you can't turn off. And he strikes me as like a theorizing machine. Like he can't not come up with theories about why things are the way that they are. And then he happened to have joined that with investing in said theories. Like Eric Weinstein, who was much more of a sane figure when he told me this, said that he thinks Peter Thiel is the world's richest applied philosopher. And I was like, oh yeah, I think that's also kind of how he sees himself.
Look, I think one of the ways in which people are lucky is that you come along at times when like certain skill sets happen to be like really rewarded, right?
Yeah.
And like, on a much smaller scale than Peter Thiel, I have this weird overlap of skills that in the exact way the media industry is working with these newsletters in 2024. Yeah. Plus you have a book coming out, which was supposed to come out a year and a half ago, right?
Oh.
We wouldn't intend to have this whole cluster bomb approach where like the podcast and the book and the newsletter like all launch at once. It was supposed to be like staggered so I could transition out of politics.
Yeah.
But then you have this election
it's worked out all right for
that turns out to be really interesting, right?
Yeah.
It was going to be deathly boring. Biden versus Trump, and every poll is +1 Trump or +1 Biden for months. Then you have this much more dynamic campaign.
Yeah.
But if something like that happens, you have to like, this is like very much being in like the right place at the right time, like several times over, really.
But Peter Thiel doesn't believe in luck, only cause and effect.
Yeah, maybe I do think I think maybe it's in some ways he's like a little bit more at peace with himself. Because if you are like Elon Musk or any like reasonably successful VC, and you're like, I am, in the 0.00001%, I'm, one of the 20 richest people out of the 80 billion people that have ever lived, it gets a little bit weird, right? You're like, how am I so the center of my own narrative as much? And especially if you're like a little bit, not off the reservation, but like a little bit, if you are independent minded and you have this kind of great life, then like, I think it gets a little weird. And you maybe start having to ask from a basic, like if I won the World Series of Poker, if I finished 5th or something, then that would be normal, right? It
wouldn't change you that much.
But if I won, I'd be like, is this really happening? You know what I mean? It would be like a little bit weird. It would be, and you wonder, is there some type of simulation or is there some type of intervention, right? I mean, I think as a Bayesian, you start to have to ask questions like those a little bit.
Yeah, but I would wonder if the explanation's a bit more simple. So you have some theories about the universe. They make you billions of dollars. Because they were interesting, or you made for a couple of good interviews, you also developed kind of a public following, or you sought out a public following. Like there's plenty of VCs that are incredibly successful and nobody knows their names.
For sure.
And they don't tweet a lot and they don't want an audience. But so you already have the proclivity of sort of wanting the recognition. You need to be the smartest guy in the room. And now you're basically only hearing from people that want something from you or are attracted to you because they think you're brilliant. And so like and then let's add on top of this the toxicity that is the sort of Twitter algorithm.
Yeah.
Just like if what you do is like spew out theories, and that's what they do. They're like, well, what about this? Maybe this is going to happen. Here's where the future is going. And early on, people would say that's crazy, or what about this? And more and more you're only hearing from people that say that's brilliant. I think those theories really are going to get weirder and weirder.
Because I've gone through different like epicycles of this, right?
Yeah.
Where like your status like waxes and wanes, and like for media, I've had like a lot of longevity.
Yeah.
And yeah, absolutely. You kind of like right now I'm in like an upcycle and have more opportunities than ever. And now it's relatively new again, and it feels good. But but I'm very afraid that because there are guys that just kind of get lost in their rich person shit, right?
Yeah.
Where they're never going to have any real criticism. If they do, they have infinite optionality to like move on to something else, right? And there's kind of no touching grass and like no reality check. And like, how do you avoid that? I mean, believe me, it's like the better problem to have than the other way around, right? But if you see yourself, and also if you are looking at a newsletter or looking at book sales where you actually have data, right? You're like, okay, I am right now, as we're talking, like in this exponential phase, which will inevitably end. And in fact, in my case, because we're very seasonal, will reverse, right? So if you're the, running the, the lobster boat truck in Maine, right? Selling lobster rolls, and you're going to be busy in August, right? Yeah. You can't extrapolate that to 12 months a year.
Yeah. But. Like I have one of my theories of Peter Thiel is fascinated by René Girard, but Rene Girard's theories are nonsense. And people only like him because Peter Thiel likes them, which of course proves Girard's theories. Like there's something about the effect of being powerful and important and right about some big things that makes it hard to then, like my friend was saying the other day, that having a contrarian theory that turns out to be correct can be a brain-destroying experience. And how do you think about that with some of these figures and people you talk about, where it's like they were the 1 out of 100,
right?
And so 99% of the population was wrong, and now they have a view that's insane or stupid or weird, and the same 99 are saying that's stupid or weird. But that's the same. It feels exactly the same way as last time.
It's very intoxicating, right?
Yeah.
The most intoxicating thing in poker is when you make a daring play, like you call down a bluff in a spot where ordinarily you're not supposed to call according to the game theory, right? Or you make a really big bet for value because someone thinks you're bluffing and you extract a huge pot when you're supposed to win a small pot instead, right?
Yeah.
So the combination of like the validation from being right and then also winning a lot of money from it, those two like stimulus at the same time, that's very intoxicating and very hard. I mean, if you play poker, the good thing is you do reach the long run. You've had great days and bad days. You kind of like simulate the world at a much quicker rate. And so you kind of learn that way. I think poker, again, I'm probably not using terms like stoicism correctly, but I think, when you go to a tournament, I played the World Series of Poker. I play a lot of poker.
Yeah.
Made the main event, final 100 players out of 10,000 last year, 2013. And by the time you get to day 6, which is as far as I made it, every hand is worth the equivalent of a couple $100,000 in expected value.
Wow.
I had a hand where I made this good call down and then doubled my chips. So I go from having, probably $200,000 in expected value in front of me to the equivalent of $400,000. And Christian, I think about it, it's like, it's monopoly money, right?
You can't just get up and walk away in the World Series of Poker, can you?
You could, but they would blind you off, right? So you'd just be paying a penalty. But you can't. You have to play to the end of the tournament. You could leave and then you'd blind off and get whatever prize you want, but you're competing for like $12 million.
But it's not like a regular casino where you can take your winnings and be like, I'm good.
Well, even in like, the best spots in poker are probably high stakes private cash games, right? And even then, you play a game and you have like a really good, often they're like 6 hours long or something. Yeah. You play a game and you have like a really good first 3 hours. There are lots of times to be like, I just want to go home and get a nice dinner or something, right? But that's considered like bad etiquette and you wouldn't be invited back to the game. So it's actually a similar dynamic in high stakes cash and regular cash in a casino where it's open invitation to anybody, then you don't have that dynamic.
Sure.
You can quit. And you often should quit probably. Yeah. Because there's winner's tilt, it's called, where you're on a winning streak. People think, tilt is when like you take a bad beat or you're on a losing streak and you're emotionally distressed about it. But like winner's tilt, when you think you're like God's gift to poker or sports betting or venture capital or media entrepreneurship or whatever else, is, very toxic as well.
Yeah. That makes sense. Yeah. I think, I think about this when I went to my publisher and I was like, I want to write a book about an obscure school of ancient philosophy. They were like, what?
Yeah.
And then, so it worked. You can learn that lesson of like, and fundamentally all entrepreneurs have some version of this dilemma, which is like, you did a thing that wasn't supposed to be possible, that everyone said wasn't going to work. And so do you take from that, like, don't listen to other people, or that you were a genius? Like the story you tell yourself coming out of having defied odds is a pivot point in your life.
I mean, I think there is some kind of social intelligence and kind of reading what's on the periphery of the acceptable, right? That could become mainstream. I think there's got to be some skill there. I don't think it's totally random.
No, I don't think it's random. It's just like, but thinking about it that way versus like, I have, I can predict the future. I'm a trend maker. I will this into the story you tell yourself determines, like, does Google see itself as this like revolutionary, like world changing company? Or they're like, hey, we bought YouTube, that turned out to work good. And then Gmail was this internal experiment that worked out okay. your story about yourself is going to determine how you interpret risk in the future and how you estimate your own capacities and competencies.
Look, I do believe that life experiences teach you a lot, which I know is a cliche, but like for some people, they have a hugely high motor in their 20s and 30s, and then they settle down, which is a normal, healthy thing to do, right? But the thing they learn in their 20s and 30s, they're no longer kind of able to like apply those lessons in like a higher leverage way. Whereas if you've had like 9 lives in media, then you're like, I still have as much energy intellectually as ever, right? And I know where I fucked things up and can course correct. And you just develop over time like different types of skills. I think I've gone from more introverted to more extroverted. And if you have, your intuition, this is a big lesson from poker too. If you have lots of experience, lots of data, then your intuition is extremely valuable, right? The problem people make is like when they're in a novel situation that they have no experience in or no good direct analogy for, then their intuition sucks, right? They should slow down and be more rigorous about a problem. Like COVID, people don't think very well about exponentials and how they work. So it's like, oh, okay, well, let's have like, Bill de Blasio, the mayor of New York at the time, was like, we're going to have to shut things down for a little bit. So go have like one big blowout at the bar the day before we shut down.
Like the day before,
And like, that's like literally the worst time possible to do it, right? That is going to offset like weeks and weeks of social distancing, whatever you call it. And like people's intuitions don't grasp that, I don't think.
Or you say, hey, everyone, let's fly home. Like everyone fly home on the same planes from those countries. Just the ability. Well, I think so it's like you have your intuition, and in some cases getting stronger. And then you're also going to be finding yourself in novel situations like that. Physicist John Wheeler talked about how like as your island of knowledge grows, so does the shoreline of ignorance. So you're going to be bumping up into stuff. And so that's where ego is such a problem, because ego says like, well, whatever you intuitively felt, it served you well, all these points. Like you talk about Musk in the book, and Peter, I've heard Peter talk about this, but like Musk as this guy who just goes all in, both in poker, but also with his companies. So there's some version where Elon Musk, this sounds very dismissive because he's obviously a genius in many ways, but it's like, he's gone all in on each one of his companies and not blown up. That doesn't mean it was a good idea. It just means he didn't blow up each of those times. And invariably, one of the times it will blow up.
Invariably, although he has, I think, many, many levels he could fall through before he gets into too much trouble.
Of course.
Look, a lot of the books about poker, so I don't feel too guilty about going back to the analogies there. In poker, you actually get enough data to calibrate, right? If I'm saying, Ryan, I know I have a really weak hand, but it just feels to me like you're bluffing. And maybe I can kind of semi-articulate that and semi-not. You can have like some meta-macro tracker in your head of like, okay, it seems like of all the times I make a counterintuitive play based on my intuition, I guess therefore it's an intuitive play, a counter math play based on my intuition, actually I'm making a profit on those plays. So let me steer toward doing that more often. And then sometimes, especially if you've been on a winning streak, then you go overboard, right? Then you're like, oh, I'm going to make this really unusual play. It's like where the math just doesn't support it at all, or you misread an opponent, because in poker, the signals are ambiguous, right? Some players get very nervous when they're bluffing. Some players are actually very calm when they're bluffing and get very nervous when they have like the opportunity to win a huge pot with a good hand. They have aces, they can't control their heartbeat or whatever. And so like, you can pick up a signal, but interpret it wrongly, where it's actually the opposite signal from what you think.
Yeah, the thing about poker is you're getting lots of reps with similar situations and mathematical situations. Whereas like, think about it. So you had some intuition from your first book, then you have intuition, the experience of your second book. But like, even if you live for a long time and write a lot more books, like 3, 4, 5 more reps, like that's the tricky thing about life, is that you don't, like I just interviewed Francis Ford Coppola, and he basically went all in on this like movie that he's doing. Like he sold his wine company, he's like betting everything on this movie. And like, maybe and if you saw that, like the last trailer, like the trailer is like all the negative reviews for his other movies. And he's basically saying like the critics have always been wrong. They're the early reviews for this new movie haven't been good, but just like, let's just wait. And so it's like that could be true, but it's not like he has like It's not like he's done it 1,000 times because it's so hard to do a movie. So that would be so like when to trust. When are you actually making a data or probabilistic decision, and when are you just fooling yourself that you are?
With books in particular, I mean, books actually have this kind of, exponential success curve a little bit. And like with books, I mean, they can always totally flop, right? Yeah. I was talking with a very well-known author who's very successful. He's like, you never written a lot of books, and like, you probably never heard of 3 of them, right? Yeah. Because 3 of them totally bombed, and
Yeah, Michael Lewis has a book that no one's heard of because it came out like on September 11th.
Yeah. Oh, that's funny.
Yeah.
So books, you inherently, I mean, anytime you have a book, I only had 2. So now I'm being ridiculous by trying to generalize from it. But
that's what I mean. It's hard, because the thing is so big, and like you even think about this with some of the entrepreneurs you talk about in the book, like they founded 1 company or 2 companies.
Yeah.
And then so you're generalizing from this experience, but it's not that much experience given the immensity of the possible experiences.
Yeah, look, I am interested in reading about the business of the media broadly, right? And I'm talking to other people who are, and just kind of doing case studies. It's not necessarily where you apply like lesson A from point X to point Z or whatever, but I just think being like a little bit immersed in that, and I guess I'm not afraid to admit that I like games of strategy. You know what I mean? And like I think it's a good product. I think it's a really good product. I worked my ass off. I've been up for I took a little bit of rest this morning, but why not figure out ways to market it well? It's like you go to like a restaurant and you're like, you have this worst fucking name. Yes. You have great food, but you have the stupidest fucking name in the history of the world, right?
Yeah.
And you're on this street that gets no foot traffic, whereas for 10% more rent, you can go to the street across the block where they get tons of foot traffic. And it's like, you just want to come on,
you made a bunch of decisions, even if luck has a lot to do with it, you made a bunch of decisions that were like objectively constraining or self-defeating.
Yeah. As a creative, if you're not willing to market yourself, maybe you don't care, right? Maybe you just are totally non-materialistic and you find a small audience and you go to some independent bookstores and you live a good life, and that's fine, right? But I think creatives need to get better at the business side of things.
Well, that's the hard part is, so if you're a novelist, you might write 5 novels in your life. So you can't get that much experience. Yeah. I got very lucky because I was in marketing before, and then I worked in book marketing. So I got to run the campaigns on a bunch of books. I did both Will McGaskill's books.
Okay.
So I got, and so all different kinds of books, all different genres, people with platforms, not with platforms, famous people, not famous people. So I could see, I got to be involved in decisions that where you're supposed to have skin in the game, but it was nice to not have skin in the game. I got to learn from other people's experiences, so sort of widen my data set. But people make a lot of dumb decisions. They're thinking of they wrote the book because it's exciting to them, and they didn't think well, how is this actually going to be relevant to people, or why would anyone have you come talk to their employee? How you decided to write about. You should write about the thing because you're interested in it. You should make the movie about it because you're passionate, whatever it is. But if you haven't also sat down and thought, how is this going to play to people? Why is it relevant? Why is it going to work? All of those things, it's not going to. You've made it unlikely that you're going to be that successful.
And the mistake of extrapolating from the line going up must keep going up. So the one smart thing I'll give myself credit for this book, because I reread the proposal, right? Proposals in February, March 2021. We're still emerging from the pandemic.
Yeah.
All the books are about how bad Trump is, or about racial equity and things like that, or gender equity, things like that.
Whatever the trends of the moment were.
Right. And I'm like, look, people are going to get sick and tired of this stuff after, especially with Biden in the White House, for after 2 or 3 more years. So having a book that's kind of unexpected and fun, so you kind of predicting a vibe shift in the desire for consuming politically adjacent.
We also have to think about the way books work, which is books have the longest shelf life of any of the forms of entertainment, right? And so, or one of the longest shelf lives. And so a lot of people write books that are very much of the moment, even though the curve for adoption for a book, how many, you ask people, what was the last book you pre-ordered? Or what was the last book you read, even within the month it came out. Like I always get around to books like, unless I'm interviewing the person, like a year later, 2 years later. So if you chose to write about something that's not going to last for a minimum of 1 year, you've already eliminated a huge chunk of its potential audience, right? And so people don't really think about those things, and as they just make creative decisions when they really needed to make creative decisions that were then weighing some of the stuff you talk about with like risk and expected value. Just a slightly different decision or a different way of positioning it could have allowed the thing to last for 10 years as opposed to 18 months.
And we're in Austin, so the home of like slow cooked barbecue. There's probably some technical term for it. Like that boiling process or the slow cooking process allows certain things to happen, right? That you see worlds evolved, you see narratives actually get tied together in unexpected ways, right? Sam Bankman-Fried is maybe one of the most important figures in the book, was like not even on my initial list in 2021. His entire rise and fall kind of happens in the time frame of the book. Or like someone like Sam Altman, where I talked to Sam in August 2022, when they kind of knew behind the scenes that like GPT 3.5 and 4 are going to be really cool, but they're not as high profile, right? And so later I tried to re-interview him, and he's like, the busiest man in the world. We do a little bit by email. I'm like, actually, this is much, given the choice to have an interview after the breakout or kind of in the middle of their process when he's less guarded in August 2022, like this interview is actually much better. The one I already had in the bag. So things like that are helpful with the book.
You never know where things are going to go. But if you are trying to think of optionality as opposed to like sort of locking things in, you have more.
Well, that's the other kind. I mean, I feel like if you understand optionality, that might be like the single most important skill if you're anywhere in kind of the entrepreneurial mindset, right? That cultivating opportunities that lead to more opportunities instead of nodes that are closed is just this incredibly valuable, exponentially better skill set, right? And it might mean saying yes to more things, to more, if I think about how I've made friends, then it's often through some friend of a friend you met at a party that you didn't actually want to go to that night or something, right? And like, but you just want to you want to go where doors are likely to open and lead to other doors. And if you don't do that, then I think you're making a big mistake. But
I struggle with that because obviously to be good at something, you have to say no to things a lot and you have to be disciplined. And at the same time, when I think about the things, like I met my book agent and some of my best friends at like a conference I went to like 12 years ago. And I wasn't going to go, and then I went. And then now I spend most of my time trying to not go to conferences. Like these random serendipitous things change the trajectory of your life. And also, though, if you went to all of them, you would never have time to do what you do. And so how do you let that randomness in without being ruled by it?
So one thing that helps me a lot, it's kind of unique circumstance, is because elections are these 4-year cycles, you naturally have up cycles and down cycles, right? So you're going at warp speed in like the June through November of an election year, and the other, 7 out of 8 times throughout the rest of the year, then you can pick your pace a little bit more.
Interesting. Yeah. One of the things I was curious about in the book, so like it seems like these VC guys, what they're really good at is realizing, okay, you can only lose the amount of money you put in, but you could potentially make an unlimited amount of money. So they kind of develop this mindset of taking these kind of chancy bets. I'm wondering if part of the world we're living in is their struggle to realize that most things in life are not that way.
For sure, right? I think they... things like their intuitions about politics tend not to be very good. Like, Peter Thiel's a smart political thinker, but like the candidates that he's kind of endorsed tend not to sell very well to mainstream America necessarily.
But I think it's more, what I'm saying is like, okay, so Peter, and I sense this very much when I was writing the book, because I remember I was in his office the day he announced that he was donating that first money to Trump. And I remember sort of asking him what he was doing. And he was like, well, it could work, and it ultimately did work in that Trump was elected. But I think he was thinking about it. It's like, okay, it's only $1.5 million, which is something only a billionaire would say. And someone who has a sense of how much money gets thrown in politics, that seems like not a lot of money. But he's thinking like, all I can do is lose this money. But actually what happens is that donation, just like the Gawker thing. He's like, hey, I'll spend $10 million. Who knows what happens? Well, it also changes the trajectory of his life in the sense that, like, I don't think the Trump thing would have happened without the Gawker thing. And I don't think being right about the Trump thing, if he had not made that bet, I think his being right about something can radicalize you. It changes the people you spend time with. It changes how the world sees you. I don't think I know he wasn't thinking about what other people would think, because that's not how he thinks. And yet you end up having to live with your reputation and your place in the world every day.
Yeah, if people who aren't doing the kind of meta rationality stuff don't realize the extent to which, when I started like writing and tweeting more about COVID, where I don't know, I think I actually have a very centrist viewpoint, right? I thought the lockdowns were bad. I think the vaccines are good, right? I thought we had to get back to normal at some point after vaccines were available. But yeah, when you're identified of a certain political bent and you're more outspoken about things, then the people that you meet change in like types of subtle ways, right? It's like not like I've ever had a friend, like maybe one, like cancel me over politics.
Yeah.
But it just kind of changes your trajectories a little bit. And if you don't realize it, then, the other thing too is, look, I think if you have a general bias, the average person is too conformist.
Yes.
But you see people in Silicon Valley in these different sub-communities in the rationalist community where maybe they have some successes and then just go way overboard, or maybe they're living their great life. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that first succulent taste of success by making a contrarian bet and having it be right is very, I think, addictive.
Yeah, it's addictive, and then it's changing the reality you're in. But I remember he said something like, and I don't mean to make this all about him. You could do this with Mark Andreessen or Ackman or whatever. But he said something. He was like, the Trump thing. He's like, there's a 20% or 30% chance this could all end in disaster, but whatever. And so it's like, if you're betting on a company, going like, there's a high chance of success and the failure is capped at 0. It's great, but like the presidency ending in disaster is, one of the possibilities there is nuclear holocaust. Like it strikes me as you need a balance of the sort of swashbuckling risk taker, and that attitude is particularly conducive and successful in places conducive to it. And then there's this other part of our world where, like, I'm not sure you want to introduce the river mentality.
Yeah, part of it too is having some like meta rationality about where are the weak points in your mental model.
Yeah.
And how fragile are they? This sounds like Taleb a little bit more. But yeah, if sometimes you're making a model, like an election model, which is pretty complex, right? There's several thousand lines of code, and you'll focus so much on some very small detail, like the 2nd Congressional District of Nebraska, which awards one electoral vote, right? But then some very major parameter, like how much error do we expect there to be in the polls? You just estimate really quickly, and or there are bugs in your code. You know, every year I go through and kind of not really rewrite the code, but go through and say, is there anything I should change? And like you discover, like, oh, there was a minus sign where there should have been a plus sign, right? And it's a very minor operation, doesn't matter, but like it's been there for 12 years now and never really affected anything. But you have to be, people I think are, they focus on the parts of the problems that are like nerd sniped, right? Where they're like, they're fun and intricate and interesting and don't kind of zoom out. And that's kind of where some of the skill comes in. And I think, if you actually have experience having skin in the game and gambling or doing things adjacent or analogous to gambling, like that makes you a lot better. Like the pure academics are almost always like really bad at modeling.
Yeah, because they don't live in the real world. Like, is there anything less real than tenure?
Yeah, it's well, I don't know, maybe, you have
I can see its value. I'm just saying, like, there's something inherently, like, we're accepting that the people we want to think about our world, we give them a kind of career where they exist in a different reality than 90% of the
maybe
population.
We should, it's the life, same with the Supreme Court appointments, right?
Yes.
Like, maybe we should have, like, 5-year grants of tenure where you have 5 years, like a MacArthur grant that's sponsored by, University of Texas or whatever, where you have 5 years where you can't be fired for any reason except for like, whatever, severe crimes, felonies.
Sure.
And you can do whatever you want. There's no obligation. And maybe these are awarded by some type of weighted lottery. So, maybe you have some people who you wouldn't think are obvious candidates who get one, and some people who are more obvious or whatever else. And like, that might be valuable for society, I think. I mean, the Thiel funds for like kids to drop out of college is kind of a little bit trollish, but it's produced some good entrepreneurs.
A bunch of incredibly successful, interesting people.
Yeah, I do think we're still on like a trajectory away from interesting stuff happening in the academy. I mean, AI is happening almost entirely outside of academia.
Yeah.
And outside of government for that matter, really. I don't know what the DoD is doing or whatnot. That's pretty interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, the idea of like, well, we don't have this because, I don't know, the government, you have tenure so the government can't persecute you. But are there that many academics doing work interesting enough that the government would persecute you? Do you know what I mean? Like they're inherently kind of not super transgressive. Like it's mostly people saying the same things.
Yeah, I mean, look, the most interesting philosophical movement in academia is probably effective altruism.
Yeah.
But they have, which you're responsible for, I guess, now in part, right? They have really good marketing.
Yes.
They have really good engagement with the outside world, and they're kind of like straddling these lines a little bit more. And yeah, the pure academic stuff. I mean, look, I think there are some course corrections. The fact that you have schools re-requiring standardized tests, I think, is probably good, and things like that. Sure.
The effective altruism thing is really interesting because I really like Will McGaskill, and I think his work's important. But it was fascinating to watch the difference between the first book and the second book, just how much money they had to throw at the book. Like, the first time they were like, okay, we got this little marketing budget. What could we do? And we came up with a bunch of interesting ideas. And then the second one, we get on these phone calls and they'd be like, well, what if we just bought 1 million copies? And I was like, well, definitely don't do that. Yeah. Like, I was like, doesn't your thing say that if you have $25 million to spend, you should save hundreds of thousands of lives in Africa and not buy books? But they were like, but if we get the ideas out in the world and then it's spread, so our mind's ability to like corrupt itself and find ways to do what ultimately just assuages the ego or makes us feel important or win recognition is just such a fascinating force to watch it happen to supposedly these hyper-rational and fundamentally decent human beings who want to make a positive difference. They went from like save the child drowning in a puddle or, eradicate malaria to like thought experiments about AI 1,000 years from now.
No, I think EA and maybe utilitarians in general wind up in this very weird space where like sometimes you're supposed to do politics, sometimes you're not, right? Yeah. I remember when like, I agree that Will is like a very thoughtful person who is a smart guy who wants to do good.
And has done good. Done good more than most people who talk about doing good, just like from his own salary donations.
Yeah, but it's a bit like, okay, so Tyler Cowen asked him about abortion, and personally I'm pro-choice, right? So it's not a concern for me. But if you're concerned about future life forms, which his book is all about, how can we maximize the happiness of future utilitarians in the world, right? Then abortion becomes complicated from that framework. And he's like, oh no, it's a woman's right to choose, of course. And you can kind of rationalize it, but like, I think it's probably a little bit inconsistent. But then you can say, oh, well, I need, most of my donors are liberals or center left, and they're very, and they're very pro-choice, and we already have a woman problem in EA, so I can't be like pro-life, and so on some grander level. And it becomes just kind of like, there's no there on some level.
Yeah, well, it's a moving target that they get to define, I guess.
Yeah, which is why I think you can't have, I don't think pure utilitarianism works. I think it falls apart on some grander level, right? It falls apart without some constraints or principles that you establish.
Well, these things, in retrospect, I think you end up, the more I kind of think about the founders, the more impressed I am with the complexity of the checks and balances that they came up with in such a short amount of time. Because, we see these movements happen, whether it's EA or, I don't know, like Wikipedia, or then you see these things happen, and then how quickly just like human nature manages to find whatever the vulnerability is. So EA is like, it's this great pure thing, it's struggling, and then they get the money they always wanted, and that money, like in some ways just breaks the whole thing, because they just didn't have. Black Lives Matter is another good example where it's like they just get hundreds of millions of dollars, and because what they actually wanted was not clear to themselves, they were actually harmed by the influx of support and money and the internal contradictions of the movement, but then also the personality flaws of the people at the head of it. Eventually, it just collapses under its own weight.
Yeah, the obsession with scale, which is partly something you can blame the VCs for, is like businesses in Europe classically, you just have like one manufacturer of Parmesan cheese that makes the best Parmesan cheese in their region of Italy for 500 years, right?
Or a winemaker. Symbols has been in business since the 11th century.
Yeah.
And that's a great business.
And like we don't tend to appreciate that type of business in America as much, especially in the content, to bring it back to our field, right? I think VCs tend to analogize media startups like tech companies when it's more like running a restaurant, right?
Yeah.
You can run one really nice restaurant. If you're very lucky, you can even franchise that to a couple of locations, and you can write a cookbook, and you can do one, Iron Chef or whatever. But there's not like this 100x scale unless you want to be Chipotle or something, which is fine, right?
Yeah, or you spin off Shake Shack from Danny Meyer's thing.
Yeah,
but it's not part of the same.
Danny, there are exceptions, right? To everything, David Chang or Danny Meyer, right, are people that have managed to kind of keep a high quality product, and they have their flagships and they have their expansion, but they're kind of like once in a generation geniuses, pretty much.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. Like the New York Times is a family-owned company, and that's
interesting.
It's publicly traded, but family-owned, and that check balance has worked. Although the Washington Post is in trouble because it's just all owned by one guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're probably moving toward winner take all in everything, right? And the Times, I think, is becoming like a winner take all media company. But to their credit, they have become. I had kind of a bad falling out with the Times when I left, right? But they brought me back in to and do op-eds with them and be in their podcasts and things like that. And so, they're not holding a grudge because they're like, we're the best media brand in the world right now. And we're not going to worry about having grudges if it makes our product better and we have more interesting content. So I think, they become a uniquely well-run business, I think. But it's also like the treadmill of human capital or the accelerator of human capital, where once you start to do well, then you develop better context and hire better talent, right? And then at some point it stops. I mean, the reason why the Xerox Corporation didn't become the dominant Google of today is because you do develop these encumbrances where, the founders lose their motivation. And then, with every node of management that you add, then you just become a lot slower about things. And I'm thinking about this stuff because this newsletter is now doing kind of insanely well. And I have, one part-time employee, and then my partner helps out de facto 2 part-time employees, basically, right? And we're beating all these companies with 30 employees and things like that. And it's
the discipline to not scale is actually really interesting. Like Machiavelli talks about not going past. No, Robert Greene talks about it via Machiavelli. But the idea of not going past the mark you aimed for, and just be I wanted to run a newsletter. I wasn't trying to start a multimedia company, and to I've had to really go I want this to just be about this big, and to put a ceiling on what you're doing. To turn down money is a really hard thing, especially if a VC person is offering you no strings attached money. But there are strings attached.
No, it's so I call it the dessert analogy, where you'll go in and you have your dinner, and you're I'm not going to have dessert. I know how to satiate myself with my main course, right? But the person selling dessert, i.e. the waiter, they know that you're kind of full, and they know how to say, here's a dessert that sounds light. It's just some strawberries and cream or something, right? Or why don't you indulge?
Yeah.
Why don't you deserve it? I know that it's an indulgence, but now it's time to indulge. Or there's something fruity, or so they always kind of are savory.
You're going to feel bad afterwards, but you can't stop yourself.
You have to be prepared for the fact that people, it's whenever there's a big scandal where everyone's emails get leaked at Sony Corporation or something. It's my expectations, there's probably some pretty bad shit in there, right? Yeah. So the fact that you identify some particular bad shit doesn't really change my priors very much, but
yeah. To just be hey, I'm willing to stay. WeWork is a really good idea.
Yeah,
it's not a $40 billion idea,
for sure,
and it shouldn't be in every city, and they don't need 50 buildings in every city. But like, yeah, so the discipline to be like, I'm going to have an extremely profitable, interesting that takes a lot of discipline, especially if you're surrounded by lots of people who don't have discipline.
Yeah, maybe you need some like VC firms that focus on that. I mean, maybe Y Combinator is kind of a little bit there. They seem to be more okay with.
But they're investing really early, hoping you become one of those companies, and then their 1% becomes worth like $1 trillion.
But yeah, it's hard. I mean, this is one of the things too, is like the inevitability in a capitalist system where people are in an independent-minded country. Like the inevitability is that there's going to be competition, and you can't turn that off. And so you may as well compete, figure out what you want, but you may as well compete, or you just get trampled, right? Or you're just screwed. It's a capitalist system, kind of in an evolutionary way. Attempts to rein that in inherently don't seem to work well, and or substantially lower human welfare.
But to go to your casino metaphor, you have to have the ability to win money and then walk away.
Yeah, which most people don't,
because you know it's going to go away if you don't.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the heart. Yeah. The other thing I thought was interesting, you were talking about this in the book, like, because there's lots to critique in The Village, but the idea of peer review or a culture of criticism. I was on this text thread with a bunch of like some of the people in your book, and the degree to which they were always complaining about media coverage of them that they interpreted as extremely negative, which a normal person like me would go, no, your company's worth $8 billion. This is actually very nice coverage. This is the expected coverage when you are not the underdog anymore. Yeah. And so that you noted that there is kind of a culture of like, we're all supposed to root for each other. And that's not how the world works, nor is it ultimately the way the world should work. No,
when you go from underdog to established incumbent, I mean, that can switch very quickly, right? Yes. And I've experienced that. And you see people turn on you, not in a personal way. I mean, I have loyal friends and I'm loyal to my friends, but the kind of general zeitgeist, whatever you want to call it, can
you're not Nate, you're a news story now.
Yeah. So Garrett Adelstein's a poker player who was involved in this famous scandal where he accused another player of cheating, right? And he was like beloved, and he's a sensitive guy, right? He's talked about his battles with depression and things like that. And he's like, I couldn't handle with now being perceived as the villain because I went maybe overboard in accusing a player who might have cheated before there was proof. And like that's very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, like the idea that Silicon Valley, it's like you guys are all rooting for each other, not because it's like this like love of the weird and the innovative or whatever. It's that you're all invested in each other, and there's some element of a hype, like a pump and dump thing that's going on here. That's accusing them of criminality in a way that they're not. But they are all incentivized to inflate the valuations of their companies, and then they're like surprised that the New York Times or random like a 20-something, reporter in New York City who's just tweeting about stuff is not equally incentivized to help them inflate the values of their company. Of course, it's like they're doing their job. And the inability to grasp that, and then also to see the good that comes from, like, if Silicon Valley had been exposed to more criticism internally, maybe the WeWork thing doesn't happen.
Yeah, look, you can always have overcompensation. I think the tech press was kind of very friendly to tech in like the Obama era, and then things started to shift, and sometimes it's unfair. I mean, I think like I'm not a giant fan of like the company Facebook or Meta, I suppose. I'm kind of a neutral opinion, but I think they were unfairly accused of like the whole Trump Russian bot thing was a very minor story that kind of got blew up and like memeified a little bit. But like, I mean, most of these people are doing exceptionally well and don't need to worry about the haters so much. But if you're someone like an Elon Musk who was very popular in both the river and the village, because it's like, electric cars and rocket ships and things like that, seriously center left, like when people turn on you, then you can just kind of lose your shit, right?
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that. I'm writing about it in the book that I'm doing now, and it's extra interesting because he like moved into this little town. Like not the Tesla factory is just on the other side of Bastrop County and Travis County, but like in this little town, like SpaceX, Boring Company. Starlink is here. He's moving all of Twitter's customer service here. He like owns this town now, which was like not the case. Like when I moved here just a few years ago, it wasn't the case. I've been here a long time, but like it's fascinating to watch. I like that thing that came up with Trump where people say like every accusation is a confession. I think it's interesting to watch someone rail about the woke mind virus when they very clearly have caught some kind of virus that it's utterly changed how they perceive the world and act in that world.
And typically there are people that are more, I mean, rationality is a loaded term.
Yeah.
But there's like, Michael Moritz seems like a pretty sane and well-rounded person, for example, or, Vinod Khosla, am I saying that right?
Yeah. Conway.
There are people who are quite sane, and like if you're writing, one bias that I think every author will confess to is like the subjects that are more willing to talk and that are more interesting story-wise are going to get like A, overemphasized in the text originally, and then B, when you do like the media for the book, right?
Yeah, sure. That's what I want to talk about.
Elon, the two Sams, Peter Thiel, and people like that, right?
Yeah.
Maybe Mark Andreessen. Those are the big five bad boys, basically. Even though they're not all bad, but
But what do you think about this? It does seem to be kind of a process where it's like they tweeted about this, then they tweeted about this, then they gave these comments. It's almost like, it's not a cliche, but it's like I know the cycle when someone's like where you're like we call it being red pilled, I guess, but you can you could almost predict where and when it happens for someone.
I think that there's like an autoimmune response that can happen. I think what's really tricky too is that like you could have the same kind of emergent behavior with things that are organic or coordinated. And it's like very hard to recognize kind of what the pathogen is.
Yeah.
You might notice that like, I don't know, I have a good example offhand. Sometimes certain phrases that may have nothing to do with anything just kind of go through ebbs and flows of like how often they're used.
Yeah.
And that just occurs over time.
Yeah.
Maybe you read in a popular book and so you start using those phrases and there's lots of subliminal shit. But also like, when Penguin is dropping my book, that's a coordinated marketing campaign where we're doing 30 interviews and months beforehand, you've emailed influential people, say, hey, you want a galley of my book. And so that's very non-viral. It can become viral. Yeah. But the spark for it is coordinated. And like, it's hard to tell which is which sometimes on Twitter. Yeah. I think 98% of the time it's actually not coordinated. Yeah. But you can get paranoid about the 2% of the time when there are, whether it's bot farms. Elon's obsession with bots, right? So it's coordinated or whatever. No, it's mostly just like people are similar to one another. Yeah. And behavior is contagious. And mostly it's spontaneous and organic. And the fact that there are exceptions to that, where you have, media groups that are trying to like shape a narrative that can happen sometimes. And it may make sense to have a scapegoat in those times, right? To focus on Elon or Nate Silver or Ryan Holiday, whatever else, right? Instead of having some diffuse focus.
Who can embody the trend or the problem that we're talking about.
Yeah, but it's mostly emergent properties of inherently complex systems and the internet.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. So you have a person who's incredibly smart, has unlimited resources, etc., and they're not immune from like whatever the algorithm can do to a person. Right. I just think that's so interesting.
Like, although if you imagine like Nick Denton, he's like, oh, things are going kind of strangely here, right? Maybe there is some, because it sounds so paranoid. Yes. What if there's a secret billionaire secretly funding this lawsuit against me? It sounds like completely fucking paranoid. Yeah. And it probably is 95% of the time, but then he's in the 5% of the 2% when it's exactly right.
Yeah, that's true. He did. There was an interview where somebody put it out, and I remember Peter saying that they thought they'd been caught, but it was too preposterous. Yeah. And so nobody believed it.
Absolutely.
So then with the time the conspiracy theorist is correct, that's the brain destroying experience, because now you see it everywhere. Like I noticed like of the people that I knew, and I don't know exactly how I came to know these people, but I knew a lot of people that were in like the paleo space, like the paleo diet.
Sure.
Almost to a man, they all became during the pandemic, like hyper radicalized about COVID and vaccines and whatever. And when I'm trying to be charitable to what happened, it's that they grew up with the food pyramid, and the food pyramid is bullshit. and not the diet you should eat. And so there kind of was this conspiracy, like to tell people that what is healthy is unhealthy and what's unhealthy is healthy. And so the people that would be attracted to that are, and then they've seen it and had it confirmed, it's going to be hard for them to trust the consensus going forward.
No, it's also because people are, language and political positioning there can be an element of bluffing, for example, right? Like if I say, I wonder, this is, a slightly spicy example, right? Yeah. Some people, when they say, I wonder about trans athletes in college athletics or something, but otherwise I'm very supportive of trans rights. And they mean that. So this is just an edge case, right?
Yeah.
Some people say that to test the waters because they're super anti-trans.
Yes.
And without more information, then you kind of don't know which is which.
Yeah. Yeah. The village is very bad, or has a lot of trouble separating good faith from bad faith.
For sure.
And that's kind of a weakness of our system. So like you think about the lab leak thing, right? Like the village rushes to kind of shut that down as a hypothesis. And part of the reason they rush to shut it down is that a good chunk of the people who are bringing it up were bringing it up in bad faith. These are the same people that doubted literally every other part of COVID. And so how like intellectually, how do you deal with ideas that may or may not be true, but are being weaponized either by foreign actors or weaponized by influencers or grifters or just people arguing in bad faith?
Yeah.
That's a really tricky thing that I don't think we've figured out well as a society.
No, I think people in effective altruism have something of the same problem, right? Where it's a small community and they were like way too trusting of SBF in particular. And there are a few other examples. But yeah, this is a big problem in the village is they don't understand that like there are people that for political reasons or for personal gain or for clout building or just because they're wrong but happen to be wrong but persuasive, right? Yeah. There are people who take advantage of your trust and take advantage of the trust that people have in this expert institution and therefore undermine the institution. So you have to police from within a little bit more. And if they're a culture of consensus, whereas in the river, we criticize or we bet, right? Maybe betting is a better mechanism, actually. But in the river, you're supposed to be critical. You're supposed to look for opportunities. You're supposed to look for an opponent whose play of a poker hand doesn't make any sense, or a bad betting line that DraftKings posts or whatever else. And so, like, I think that's actually a healthy impulse up to a fairly high point.
I'm saying kind of the opposite, though. Like, so if someone is arguing something from bad faith, like they're not smart, they're a conspiracy theorist, they're whatever, it doesn't necessarily mean that idea is untrue.
That's probably true. Oh, yeah.
And so I think that's during the pandemic, there were like, when you had a group of people who were just deciding that the virus did not exist and it had no consequences, and they were politically motivated to continue to just resist whatever the people in power were doing, there kind of became this reflexive dismissal of every concern and doubt. So like when they were like, hey, I think it's time, like in Texas, we reopened everything in June of 2020, which was objectively too early. Yeah. But then when people were trying to reopen schools in June of 21 in California, those people were treated as though they were the same people, and they're not, right?
Yeah, maybe we should look at political beliefs as kind of not that important in terms of forming interpersonal relationships. Because like for religion, I guess I call myself agnostic or something, right? But probably a phase, right? I call myself more aggressively atheist, right? If someone's like, I'm a practicing Catholic, I wouldn't have been in that phase like, oh, fuck you, I'm never talking to you again. You must be crazy, right? Yeah. It's like, okay, you have a belief system and we can still go and get a beer together or enjoy hobbies together or whatever, right? Have a friendship, relationship. People, I think, need to indulge other people's, incorrectness sometimes more often, knowing that it's reciprocal, that you undoubtedly have beliefs that they find wrong or objectionable or annoying, and they're still your friend. So I think people should think about that.
It's funny, Obama talked about this in his convention speech.
Yeah.
That like especially for Democrats who are by definition, having to create a fairly large consensus. Like you need a lot of people, so you're a coalition. So you can't be a minority position can be intellectually pure, but if you're trying to create a broad consensus, you can't.
No, I mean, Democrats have always been the party of misfit toys, right?
Yeah.
People who are intellectuals, people who are struggling, right? Gay people and immigrants and things like that. It's misfit toys, and you have to tell. I mean, one thing I love about New York City, where I live, is like in New York we have to tolerate one of those eccentricities, right?
Yeah.
You cannot, because you just will not survive a day without like having like high practical tolerance, which is like different than like the Dutch tolerance, right? Which is, I have some like Dutch friends, like you can do what you want, but they're judging you the whole time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I saw this TikTok and they were talking about it and they were just like, the rules of New York City is like, you didn't see shit.
Yeah.
You're embracing it. It's just like you're fucking minding your own business and you're not, somebody's jumping the subway turnstile. I don't know. I didn't see. Just like that. That's kind of the don't ask, don't tell is obviously a bad phrase given what it was used to do, but it's not a bad policy for the rest of life.
It might not have even been a bad policy for the military in that environment, right?
Sure.
It's better than persecuting somebody for having gay relations, right? In the Navy.
I'm saying it doesn't go far. It was inherently discriminatory. You're right. That there was some good intention in it, but I just generally not asking, not telling, as Tim Walz has been saying, mind your damn business. It's a good strategy for life.
No, one other poker thing.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll keep going back to poker, but like there is a cost to giving away information, right? That there are reasons why you want ambiguity sometimes, and you don't want like complete transparency.
Yeah.
And you are communicating by not saying something. Yeah. And you can increase optionality with ambiguity.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like one reason why I think that large language models prove surprisingly good is that like language is very game-like in many respects. So they're good at solving chess or poker. It shouldn't be surprising that they understand how speech works.
Well, shutting the fuck up is a way to increase optionality.
Yeah.
William Tecumseh Sherman had this thing. He's like, never explain why you think what you think, because you might change your mind.
Right.
So your reasons could change. The conclusion might stay the same, but your reasons for it could complain. But so the optionality of like, I'm not going to explain my opinion on everything or verbalize every thought as it's coming into existence is a way to preserve optionality, your reputation, and then also your sanity, because you're not locking yourself into stuff.
Or there might be kind of different equilibria, right? Either being really reserved or, look, if you're running a newsletter, then like a confessional style really works. Like I'm not posting this newsletter today because I'm, I don't know. I'd be like, because I'm like, on a plane right now and the Wi-Fi's not working. I just want to relax. And like that can work, I think, or being like quite selective and quite reserved. And, I think one problem that like I had kind of working for the Walt Disney Company is I was stuck kind of exactly in the middle ground where I felt constrained, but then the constraints come out in Twitter or in different ways. And like, it wasn't very ideal.
I was thinking about this the other day. Like if I was going to inflict a horrible fate on someone, like I was kind of coming up with a torture, like, there's that Chinese curse, like, may you live in interesting times. Oh, it's raining. One torture would be, you're going to have strong opinions about everything you see, hear, and read. You see how people inflict this fate on themselves. I mean, Twitter and social media is designed around prodding you and nudging you to have more opinions, concise opinions, polarizing opinions. And so you not only get yourself into trouble because you can say things that you regret, but I think it changes you as a person because it opens you up. First off, you're now thinking that way, but also you are getting feedback for thinking that way. And it becomes this kind of vicious cycle where you just become hardened and cynical, and also just like, I interviewed Stephen A. Smith one time and I was like, you have a thing that you can't turn off, which like, you ever see him, like they'll ask him like opinions about like, who would win, like this Disney character or that Disney character? And he can like off the top of his head, just like create minutes of opinions about things that he's never thought of before. That strikes me as, he's actually funny, but like to do that to someone,
genius actually, but like,
do that to someone would be like a horrible thing. It feels like.
I mean, I feel like I have trouble turning it on. I don't know.
Yeah.
But you can absorb and read, and you don't have to like participate. But yeah, it is hard. I mean, one thing I like about poker is it kind of, because you can't leave a poker tournament without paying a price, it kind of is a commitment device a little bit,
Yeah.
And
how does that help?
It helps because it's probably good to have some downtime to reflect. And I enjoy poker. And in principle, I'm in games where I'm in principle making money, but usually the opportunity cost would make it negative relative to some other way to spend my time.
But I mean, the commitment device, it just makes you have to stick with the thing you're doing. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. So say, okay, I'm going to the World Series of Poker for, June 5th through June 22nd, and I can't schedule any meetings, go to any conventions, right?
Yeah.
Anything else during this time. And like, it's nice, probably you're better off like going to Japan or something, although I really like poker. But I think it's very important if you're creative to have downtime, right? I'm not one of those people who now I'm supposed to say that I have to do it, but the people who are like, oh my gosh, I have a 20-minute Uber ride from downtown SF to SFO airport. I'm going to bang out these 6 emails. You can't do that, or at least my metabolism doesn't work that way.
Yeah, Churchill wrote this book called Painting as a Pastime, and he said that every important public person has to have 1 or 2 hobbies.
Yeah.
And his was painting and bricklaying. And you have to have this thing that's very different than what you do, or it doesn't have to be super different, but it has to be kind of use different muscles, put you in different scenarios, and the having that conduit, I think, prevents you from going crazy in your work life and using that as your only means of expression and your only form of meaning in your life.
Yeah, or something for the local equilibrium, maximizing that and not the global equilibria is a very nerdy way to put it, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, I want to show you some books next door. You got a second?
Of course, yeah.